Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, May 19th. Tonight, senior government sources say the Liberals have decided to ban Chinese vendor Huawei Technologies from Canada's blueprint for next-generation mobile networks. Critics, including the opposition Conservatives, have long pressed the Liberals to deny Huawei a role in building the country's 5G infrastructure, saying it would allow Beijing to spy on Canadians more easily. Public health authorities in Montreal are investigating 17 suspected cases of monkeypox in the area. The disease is typically limited to Africa, and rare cases in the U.S. and elsewhere are usually linked to travel there. A small number of confirmed or suspected cases have been reported this month in the UK, Portugal, and Spain. Dr. Mylene Druin says the disease is transmitted by close contact and droplets, and there is no reason for people to panic. The race for a new United Conservative Party leader is gearing up after Alberta Premier Jason Kenney announced he is stepping down. Mr. Kenney received just enough support in a leadership review for him to keep his job, but he said last night that it wasn't enough for him to stay on. Two former leaders of the province's Wild Rose Party, Brian Jean and Danielle Smith, have signaled that they intend to run for the leadership. Wild Rose merged with the Progressive Conservatives to form the UCP in 2017. Meanwhile, a Liberal cabinet minister from Alberta says Premier Jason Kenney's decision to resign is part of a troubling trend in Conservative politics. Randy Boissonnault says he believes Mr. Kenney was pushed out of the Alberta United Conservative Party for not being extreme enough. Mr. Boissonnault was responding to Mr. Kenney's decision to resign as Premier and leader of the United Conservative Party after narrowly winning a leadership review. He says it appears the former federal Conservative cabinet minister was pushed out for not being tough enough on measures like COVID-19 restrictions. All right, moving to Ontario now, where the leaders of two of the four main political parties have tested positive for COVID-19. That means NDP's Andrea Horwath and the Green Party's Mike Schreiner will be campaigning virtually as the provincial election campaign reaches the halfway mark. Progressive Conservative leader Doug Ford is in the Niagara region today, and Liberal leader Stephen Del Duca is in Mississauga. Experts and advocates say more Canadians could be at risk of going hungry as inflation continues to outpace grocery budgets. University of Toronto professor Valerie Tarasuk says worsening inflation rates are likely to raise the prevalence and severity of food insecurity. Statistics Canada says consumers paid 9.7% more for food at stores in April compared with a year ago. This is the largest increase since September of 1981. Some food banks say soaring prices have accelerated the already surging demand for their services during the COVID-19 crisis. The federal government says China has lifted its restrictions on Canadian canola after a 3-year trade dispute. Ottawa says it has been advised that China has reinstated market access for two Canadian canola companies. In March 2019, the Chinese government blocked canola shipments from Richardson International and Viterra by suspending their licenses. This after the arrest of Huawei's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou. Meanwhile, the federal government has weighed a decision to lift the Canadian flag from Halfmast. Documents show details of consultations with Indigenous leaders and some residential school survivors. The flag was lowered for months following the discovery of what were believed to be the remains of 215 children at the former Kamloops Residential School in British Columbia last May. By June, federal officials were trying to figure out when to raise the flag. Documents show some survivors told Ottawa that they didn't want to wear a decision to raise the flag. On the West Coast, Vancouver's airport authority says it's expecting this to be its busiest weekend since the pandemic began. It says domestic passengers should arrive at least 2 hours in advance, while international flyers should give themselves 3. Prince Charles and his wife Camilla will wrap up their trip to Canada with a celebration of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee in the Northwest Territories today. Their itinerary began in Yellowknife, followed by a visit to the Yellowknife's Dene First Nation community of Deta. Today's stops were meant to continue the trip's focus on climate change, literacy, and Crown Indigenous relations. The busy schedule follows similar stops in St. John's and Ottawa over the past 2 days. Up next, Forum Daily takes a look at the markets and gets some expert advice on investing. We'll be joined by Thomas Caldwell, chair of Caldwell Securities Limited, for his outlook on the markets. So stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after a short break. We'll see you soon. Stocks fell in morning trading on Wall Street Thursday, which deepens a slump of major indexes as persistently high inflation continues to weigh on the economy. The S&P 500, the benchmark for many index funds, fell 0.4%. It's down about 18% from the record high it set earlier this year, nearly at the 20% point that defines a bear market. Investors have been worried that the soaring inflation that's hurting people shopping for groceries and filling gas is also walloping company profits. In fact, Target fell again, a day after losing a quarter of its value on a surprisingly large drop in profits. Well, joining us now to give us his outlook on the markets is Mr. Thomas Caldwell, chair of Caldwell Securities Limited. Sir, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you, Nima.
Now, it's clear that these markets have continued to react to shifting world events. When do you think we'll be seeing a point of stability, sir?
Probably never. The whole nature of economies, markets, and world affairs is we go from crisis to crisis. And throughout all of that, our job is to seek opportunities within those crises. So, I think there's an old phrase, there's no time more uncertain than the present. So we're going to have this. We have wars, we have inflation, we have interest rates, we have China, we still have COVID. There's all this stuff, and a lot of them are overlapping. And a bit of them will get cleared up over time, or they'll sift into the background. But in the meantime, as they present crises, as they present panic even, that's really where opportunities live. I did a little bit of buying yesterday in the stock market, actually. So there's always things to do.
And we mentioned some investors are concerned about how these rising prices are impacting consumer spending and in turn company profits. What are you seeing, Mr. Caldwell?
Well, you have to look at it on a company by company basis. I mean, Target's declined yesterday. I've never been particularly impressed with that company anyway. So, I mean, you're going to have the weaklings get hammered to some degree, but the patterns of spending are so changed now. For example, the consumer has a lot of cash. They have lots of money available. They've been reliquefying by not spending during COVID. So you are having, a realignment of spending. And listen, as prices go up, people may drive less in their car. They may switch from steak to hamburger. They may eat out less, although the Uber bicycle guys seem to be doing some land office business. So you change your patterns. People aren't stupid. They will adjust to whatever the reality is. But remember one thing about I guess, the inflation side. It is supply side induced. It is not necessarily excess of demand. It's the fact that you can't get goods, you can't get raw materials, you can't get microchips, and these are driving prices up. And also the government's stupidity in great measure. I mean, okay, let's hammer the energy industry. Well, guess what? Up go oil prices. But it goes over a long period. Even housing, to build a house or build buildings in Toronto or a condo is a nightmare. So regulations and all of these things, they add to it. So a lot of this inflation is supply side induced. It's not excess demand. It is in some areas, but basically the supply side. And that tends to work its way out. It tends to resolve itself.
All right, Mr. Caldwell. Well, meanwhile, there seems to be a rise in young investors through these investment apps and trading platforms. What sort of advice would you give to these young and first-time investors looking to invest online?
Well, I think basically a lot of them have been sold a bill of goods that it's an easy game when the markets are going up. Everybody's smart in a bull market. And the most important thing in managing money is controlling emotions, your greed, your fear, controlling those. And the best way to do that is with some advice, bouncing your ideas around. And if you do that, you have a lot better chance of survival. So I would say, seek advice. The thing with doing it yourself, if you arrive into this game and say, I'm going to really make a lot of money, you're coming up against pro traders and guys like me, and we're going to get you eventually. So I would say, get some advice, because to think you can do it yourself is arrogance. And markets have a very brutal way of dealing with arrogance. We've seen that in the first part of the year. A lot of these do-it-yourselfers have been massacred in this market.
All right, Mr. Caldwell, just about a minute left here, but what are you keeping your eyes on as the markets continue to shift according to world events?
There's always one or two that are really what I call the determining factor. I think the key factor right now is still the Ukraine, believe it or not. This is sadly looking like it's going to be a long, drawn out, painful affair, but it's impacting Europe, it's impacting supply chains, it's impacting inflation. So that is clearly a very, very important factor. There's lots of other stuff overlapping that are quite important. But if I say that was the main thing I watched, because once you get Ukraine done, now we're going to go to rebuilding in Europe, realigning gas and oil supplies, rebuilding Ukraine. America is going to be building support, shortening supply chains. So I think for today, that would be the determining factor in my mind.
Definitely something to keep our eyes out for. Mr. Caldwell, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you so much.
Stay with us. More news from around the world coming up next on Forum Daily. We'll be right back after a short break. The CPP Investments Fund earned a net return of 6.8% for its latest fiscal year. The Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board says private equity, infrastructure, real estate, and credit investments were the main contributors to the fund's overall performance for the year. It says net assets were $539 billion as of March 31st, due to a $34 billion increase in net income and $8 billion in net transfers from the Canada Pension Plan. The fund earned a 5-year net return of 10% and a 10-year net return of 10.8%. Well, on the East Coast, Nova Scotia's Bluenose 2 is inviting passengers back this summer after a 2-year hiatus due to COVID-19 restrictions. A spokeswoman says the crew has been prepping the schooner since April 1st, and the cruises are scheduled to return June 10th. Most of the cruises will take place in the Bluenose's home base of Lunenburg. It is also scheduled to arrive in Halifax for cruises in September. On the other side of the country, the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority is joining with counterparts to explore the feasibility of a green marine corridor. A news release from the Port of Seattle says a green corridor is a marine route where zero greenhouse gas emission solutions are demonstrated and supported. The Port Authority will work with counterparts in Seattle, Juneau, Alaska, and their partners in the cruise industry. Environmental organization Stand Earth is calling the move an incredible first step toward addressing the environmental impacts of the cruise ship industry. However, Stand Earth also urges the ports and industry to ensure the corridor is truly green and doesn't rely on fracked gas-based hydrogen or environmentally damaging biofuels. Southern Manitoba is preparing for more rain as the province cleans up from flash floods and other destruction caused by a sodden spring. Most of the southern and central water basins have received more than 150% of normal precipitation since April 1st. The situation was made worse last weekend in the west by heavy rains that led to damaging flash floods. Almost 40 municipalities and 10 northern communities are getting provincial support, and about 2,500 Manitobans have left their homes. The province says a significant weather system is forecast to bring heavy rains of between 30 millimeters and 40 millimeters by tomorrow. All right, well, back in the east, the PEI government has expanded eligibility for 3 home heating programs. Under the changes, more residents can apply for free heat pumps, free hot water heaters, and insulation upgrades. The 3 programs will expand eligibility to include islanders with a household earning under $55,000 a year. Environment Minister Stephen Myers says the programs will help PEI in becoming the first net zero province in Canada by 2040. Blackberry is forecasting that revenues will nearly double over the next 5 years, with growth from the Internet of Things outpacing cybersecurity. The Waterloo, Ontario-based company, which reports in U.S. dollars, says it expects revenues, excluding contributions from licensing, should reach $1.2 billion in fiscal 2027. And $886 million in 2025, which is up from $655 million last year. The projected revenues outlined during its annual Analyst Summit represents a 13% compounded annual growth rate over 5 years. Global Live Capital is also looking for revenue growth and has signed a network and spectrum sharing agreement with TELUS. However, it is conditional on its successful acquisition of Freedom Mobile. The move is aimed at bolstering Global Live's bid to buy Canada's 4th largest wireless carrier. Freedom Mobile is up for sale as a result of Rogers Communications' efforts to win regulatory approval of its deal to buy Shaw Communications, which is Freedom's current owner. Quebecor has also expressed interest in the carrier, and rural internet provider ExploreNet Communications has reportedly been presented to regulators as a potential buyer. Fans have watched more than 2.8 billion minutes of game action on MLB TV through the first 40 days of the regular season. Now, that is a record for the streaming platform and a 9% increase over the same period last year. 3 of the most watched days on the 20-year-old streaming package have been this season, and the 3 most watched games occurred during the first 2 days of the season. And the second strike in CFL history is over. The league confirmed on Wednesday night that it and the CFL Players Association reached a tentative collective bargaining agreement. The contract must still be ratified by both the CFL Board of Governors as well as the Players Association membership. But the expectation is players will report their teams today. Forum Daily will be back after the break with a look at news happening around the world as Russia claims that more Ukrainians have surrendered at Mariupol and a war crimes trial continues in Ukraine. We'll have these stories and more coming up shortly after the break. The head of NATO says he's confident that Sweden and Finland will be joining the alliance soon, despite opposition from Turkey. Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg says NATO remains in close contact with all 3 countries. During a trip to Copenhagen, Mr. Stoltenberg would not be drawn into a discussion of the substance of Turkey's objections, but he said whenever an ally raises concerns, the only thing to do is sit down and talk. All right, well, meanwhile, Russia says hundreds more Ukrainian fighters have surrendered. This comes after emerging from the stronghold in Mariupol, where they made their last stand. The Red Cross is working to register the fighters as prisoners of war. This as the end of a key battle in the conflict draws closer. The Russian military says more than 1,700 Ukrainian troops at the Azovstal steelworks have surrendered since Monday. All right, well, all of this comes as a Russian soldier has testified that he shot a civilian because an officer ordered him to do so. The soldier is facing the first war crimes trial since the start of the war in Ukraine. The 21-year-old could get a life sentence if he's convicted of shooting a 62-year-old man in the head through an open car window on February 28th. He told a court in Kyiv today that the officer insisted that the man, who was speaking on his cell phone, could pinpoint their location to Ukrainian forces. He asked the victim's widow, who was also in the court, to forgive him for what he did. Turning to the U.S. now, where the white man accused of murdering 10 black people at a supermarket in Buffalo, New York, has been indicted on a first-degree murder charge. Prosecutors in New York can only charge someone with first-degree murder under special circumstances, such as when there are multiple victims. The single count against 18-year-old Peyton Gendron covers all 10 deaths at the supermarket. Afghanistan's biggest media outlet says the country's Taliban rulers have ordered female TV presenters on all TV channels to cover their faces while on air. Tolo News says in a tweet that the order came from the Virtue and Vice Ministry, which enforces the group's rulings. It says the ministry said the order was final and non-negotiable. The order comes after a decree earlier this month that required women to wear head-to-toe coverings that leave only their eyes visible while in public. After seizing power in August, the Taliban signaled they had moderated past restrictions on women, but the latest decrees mark a sharp hard-right pivot. Moving to North Korean propaganda that describes an all-out effort to fight a suspected COVID-19 outbreak that has sickened nearly 2 million people. But defectors say fear is palpable among North Korean citizens who lack access to hospital care and struggle to afford even basic medicine. They also worry the true scale of the outbreak is being concealed. North Korea lacks vaccines, intensive care units, and other medical assets that ensured millions of sick people in other countries survived. Back in the U.S., the number of Americans collecting unemployment benefits is at a 53-year low. This even though more of them applied for jobless aid last week. The U.S. Labor Department reports that applications for unemployment benefits rose by 21,000 to 218,000 for the week ending May 14th. But the total number of Americans collecting jobless benefits for the week ending May 7th fell again from the previous week. It is at its lowest since December 27th, 1969. Female referees will make World Cup history this year by working games at a major men's tournament for the first time in Qatar. FIFA has picked 3 female referees and 3 female assistant referees among 129 officials for World Cup duty. French referee Stephanie Frappard has already worked men's games in World Cup qualifying and the Champions League. FIFA's list also includes a man who caused some controversy when refereeing a chaotic African Cup of Nations game this past January. A bronze statue of Indigenous hockey trailblazer Fred Sasaka has been unveiled in Saskatoon. Mr. Sasaka from the Atakakup Cree Nation was one of the first Indigenous hockey players to play in the National Hockey League. He played for the Chicago Blackhawks during the 1953 to 1954 season. His son Neil says seeing the statue was overwhelming, and he wishes his dad was still alive to see it. Fred Sasaka died in November 2020 after contracting COVID-19. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.